Hey everyone, in this video we're going to overhaul the Fire Emblem support system. This is a follow-up from another video I made about why the FE support system sucks and has to go, and from the response I got from that video, I'm getting the sense that most people agree that the support system is flawed, but the video got criticism too from people that felt like throwing it out entirely was bad, and they didn't really like my suggestions on what to replace it with either. So I'm going to engage with some of that criticism since I'm willing to go along with that for a bit. Now, I'll be the first to admit that the points in my previous video were very all-in, black and white, all or nothing, especially if you take the thumbnail and the title at face value, which, fair enough, they were phrased very strongly. So today, I will try to explore if there's some room for nuance here. If you didn't watch that video, I would recommend doing so. It's only 12 minutes long, which is way below average for my videos. The link, I'm sure, is somewhere to be found. But if you'd rather keep watching, that's fine too, because I'll briefly recap some of the most important parts when needed. And we're going to do all this to the tune of a good old tier list, where I ranked all Fire Emblem games based on how good their support system is. That includes things like base convos and other things that I'll mention along the way. Now, unlike most of my tier list videos, where the list itself tends to be the focus, I'd like you to think of it as a discussion starter rather than a rigid ranking of how good every game did it exactly, because every support system has so many facets to it that ranking them from best to worst doesn't really help a lot here. But it does make it easy to look at the series as a whole and see which games have facets that we want to cherry pick from. Facets. I forgot how to pronounce that word. So let's start with likely the least controversial things off the list, the bottom part, as always. These games have no supports. The characters have barely any characterization at all. Some of them literally only have their death quote, and that's it. Cool. Done. Let's move on. Next, I have the plain/empty tier. This is for games with no support conversations, just some support bonuses to characterize a little bit, see some relationships between characters, and they give a gameplay benefit. This is fine for the times that these games were made in, but I can't really get away with calling this good now, can I? So I won't defend it here. Now next, let's do the other easy part, the top tier. These are two games that I think most people can agree on did a good job with next to no flaws, Path of Radiance and Shadows of Valentia. I think these games balanced the various things that supports try to do pretty well. Not perfectly, but they avoided most of the pitfalls that the games fell into, while having some huge pros of their own. FE9, Path of Radiance, of course, has the best support building system in the series from a gameplay perspective. Characters build supports simply by being deployed together, and because of that, the game developers know roughly or exactly where the player is, and this allows supports to be more grounded on how far the story is developed. It allows them to refer to things that have already happened instead of being in a contextless void, which was my main criticism for supports in many other games. The conversations take place at the base instead of on the battlefield, which sometimes makes GBA supports very awkward. There's no avatar character in FE9, which generally tends to be the worst supports, and also every character only supports a handful of people. Not too many, but not too few either. It's a nice happy medium. Also, the game has base conversations that further allow people to talk about things that are currently happening. This is something you can't really do in supports. It makes it easier to involve more than two people in a conversation as well. And this game even integrates character death in these conversations if that happens. They really went all in for Path of Radiance. Now, SOV, generally speaking, I don't think of this tier list as being ordered within a tier, but I do think SOV is in some ways a step down from Path of Radiance. It does have some pros of its own that Path of Radiance lacks. Most important is, of course, that SOV has phenomenal voice acting, which lets every support carry a bit more weight and breathe more life into the characters. Supports are built through battling together instead of just being deployed together, which makes them a bit more of a hassle to build up, but it's still pretty easy. And I do like this better than just them being deployed together on some level because it makes more sense. Every support in SOV, I would say, is a little bit shorter than your average convo in Fire Emblem, which I don't think shorter is necessarily worse, but these conversations in other games can drag on a little bit, I think, especially when voice acting can really bloat the game. But sometimes in SOV, I find myself wanting more than what we do end up getting. And this is not just about the length of the conversation, but also the number of conversations. This game has way less supports than I think almost any series that has support conversations. Most people in SOV, and I didn't notice myself before recording this, only get one support conversation with one other character. Some lucky people get 2, Alm and Claire get 3, and Celica gets 4. No one has more than that. It's astonishing how few supports we got in this game. Now, I prefer quality over quantity if I have to choose, but this is a shockingly this is a shockingly low amount. That said, we do get base convos in this game every now and then at the explorable locations, you know, like the shrines and stuff. And there's a handful of people that get involved in the story every now and then, which is kind of what I advocated for in my previous video. One of the strongest criticisms that I got, in my opinion, one of the strongest criticisms is that having everyone be more involved in the main story would bloat the game. If the writers felt obliged to have Kamui and Cliff and Luthier say something about every single thing ever, I think you might get a game like Three Houses where everyone stands in a circle and does their little gimmick, which I agree is not ideal. So overall, if I was in charge of the next game, and if I wanted to keep the support system in, I would start with these 2 games as the basis for a good system, and then we expand from there, which whatever else we find is useful from other games. Now, the last 2 tiers are the 2 biggest ones. This one is called Big Ups and Downs, and this one is called Bad. To the point where I think it's easier to take the good parts they do have and put them in the aforementioned template of the best 2 games than it is to try and fix the support systems that's in these actual games. Now, in Bad, I have 5 titles where I think the system is, well, significantly worse than just big ups and downs, but we can argue about which belong where. It doesn't really matter to me. I got Shadow Dragon in here because there's no conversations. It's basically just the FE5 system, except it builds up like Path of Radiance. That part is good, except the game doesn't tell you it's there. It's completely hidden, and it's in a game where people have 0 other forms of characterization, so it's bad. Then I've got the GBA games because End Turn Fest is indefensible. I do actually think the support quality of these games is a little better than some of the games above it, and I think that's partially because there's just not that many that they had to write compared to later games, and they lack one other element that really hurts the other games. I've already spoiled what it is earlier, see if you paid attention. I think for FE6 in particular, it's worth mentioning that support bonuses were likely intended to help with the gameplay. Like, the hit rates in that game are notoriously bad, but the support bonus to, for example, hit is pretty huge. Like, you can get up to 25 total. So that might have been part of the thought process, but the execution, I mean, you've seen how many turns you have to wait for unlocking like Corel Z's or something. Like, it makes no sense. Finally, in Bad, I have Engage, which is just such a mess. I think it has almost every single problem a support system can have, and then a little more. So I'll go over Engage's problems, and keep in mind that a lot of them apply to the games in Big Ups and Downs as well, so we don't have to go over them repeatedly. First of all, there's that problem of C supports being very similar, which I think Engage has worse than a lot of other entries. Maybe it's the small sample size on my end, but some of the early game characters have such boring supports because of this. I'm thinking of like Celine and Chloe particularly. Every character has to start supports roughly the same way because they can be unlocked in any order, and this is a problem that plagues a lot of these other games too, of course. Engage's voice acting can't really save this because like the acting and directing is probably fine for Engage. I'm not a very good person at judging these things, but it's not. I think the quality is a bit lower than SOV personally. Voice acting is in a way optional, that you can turn it off or skip it. I always find it really jarring to skip voice acting, especially if I'm recording a Let's Play. I'm all for skipping content that I don't like, but with voice acting, it feels like I'm being rude and I'm cutting off the voice actors when they're putting their hearts into it. And I imagine for anyone watching Let's Plays, it sounds really jarring to listen to as well. Like, I find it jarring to listen to while I'm playing it. Like, if I read a line while they're talking, and then when I'm done reading, I advance the dialogue, it makes everyone sound like they're super rushed to say everything. It doesn't sound very good. The alternative is to let the whole line play out. And when it's a support that I'm just not super into, that sucks too. I just have to sit there and wait for them to finish talking. I'm not saying that voice acting for supports is a bad thing in and of itself. I'm just laying out a particular weird frustration I have with uninteresting dialogue being combined with full voice acting. I do want full voice acting to stay because it can add a lot. This is just an additional problem that comes up in games like Engage. Now, a real issue with engaged supports and many of these games is one that I've tiptoed around a bit so far, both in this video and the last one, but I can't really subtly work around it anymore. The problem is avatars. Avatars have their share of issues, and when I say avatars, you know the characters I mean, right? I don't have to define them here for you. But avatars have their share of issues, and going over all of them here would result in some of the coldest takes in the Fire Emblem fandom. But for now, I want to focus on the stranglehold they have over the support system. The whole point of these self-inserts seems to be that they can support and maybe romance everyone, but that means they take up such a massive amount of resources in writing and voice acting if that's in the game, that I suspect that it takes away from what we could have gotten instead. You know, resources are finite, even when you're making a game. Now, I'd be okay with that if what was written was interesting, but generally, I don't think it is. You can disagree if you want. It depends on the game and the avatar. Some of them are worse than others. I think we can probably all agree that Byleth has the most boringest support out of all of them. But honestly, I personally don't really care for any of them. Now, I know that there's a sizable portion of the fan base, the English fan base, and the Japanese fan base, and the developer team as well, that likes Avatar characters a lot, and they're probably the reason, or partially the reason, why the support system is the way it is right now. I think for the support system and the non-main characters to get the love that they deserve, we'd be better off without an Avatar, because I think it's holding them back. But I don't have a problem with anyone enjoying any aspect of the Avatar or romance in Fire Emblem, just for the record. I'm just not one of those people. And I would prefer to see more and more interesting characterization instead of what we've gotten. Whether that's Chris, or Robin, or Korn, or Byleth, and Shez, and Alir. I think after 6 iterations, we can draw some conclusions on what they do and do not do with avatars. I think that what I just said sufficiently covers the most important negative aspects of the games in these 2 tiers when it comes to supports. But let's do a quick lightning round for some unique pros and cons that these games have that I haven't gotten to mention yet. Radiant Dawn, of course, has base convos, but not enough of them, and they mostly go to characters that already have a lot of screen time, like Makai and Soth and Ike. I think of base convos as a way to balance that a little bit, and they didn't really do that looking back at it. Especially because this game gimped support convos into short 2-line battle convos. I think that's a big miss. New Mystery has base convos and has everyone, but they focus on the main characters and aren't interesting. Three Houses has characters talk to you in the monastery, which is a massive plus. I don't think I gave this enough praise last time. Basically, the game has infinite base convos. That's a way of like working with it. It's not exactly the same, but it's almost as good, really. It does way more for the characters than the talks that they have during the cutscenes, where they like stand in a circle and do their whole thing. Now, like I said in the last video, I also like that Three Houses has cutoffs for supports, both like minimum and maximum chapters to get them in, which allows you to control a little bit what the conversation is going to be about, makes it more relevant. I don't think the cutoffs they picked always make sense. Leone B. Byleth is a perfect example of this. I've also heard that Three Houses changes some support convos based on when you unlock them. I don't have any examples myself of that, so if you have them, feel free to post them in the comments, but that's just something I heard that I wanted to throw in there, because I feel like being positive right now. I also like that one thing they did with Dimitri and Felix, I think, where you get a special sword for one of the supports. I don't know why they only did that once, because I thought it was really cool. And of course, I like what the monastery and things like meal sharing do for support building, because like I said earlier, it makes more sense for you to grow close to someone you actually do things with than just because you were on the same battlefield. That part is good. Obviously, I have my problems with the monastery gameplay loop as a whole, but that part of it I like. I can kind of say the same thing about Fates and Awakening's pair-up system. I have problems with those mechanics for sure, but this is not the video for them. I like what that does for support building. I do think these games need to be way more transparent about how far you're removed from your next support, and it should be an easy way to check your support points. Like, we know how they work as the fandom because people data mined it and track it with spreadsheets and everything, but it shouldn't really be that hard. Fire Emblem is pretty good at being transparent with the battle forecast and everything. They can do that with supports too if they wanted to. Also, Fire Emblem Warriors, like the original Fire Emblem Warriors is here. It has one convo between like a couple pairs of characters that they felt like writing a support for. I thought it was cute, and that's why I wanted to throw it on here. It doesn't really fit in this tier list otherwise. While we're talking about spin-offs, some people said that Three Hopes, Three Hopes does some things well. It's been a long while since I touched that game. I kind of liked how characters got their own paralog to do things in, and they had supports without necessarily attaching a convo to every level, which I thought was a good move. Of course, there were still a ton of supports, all voice acted, so the fatigue in watching them was still there for me, like it was for Three Houses and Engage. But I thought I would throw that game some positive feedback because, God, Three Hopes really came and went. Anyway, let's sum this up, alright? Yes, dear comment section, upon further investigation, it appears that it might be better if we recycle some elements of the support system rather than throw that all away. You've made that point, and I appreciate that point. I actually think it's a good point. Can we agree, though, that it has to be a very thorough overhaul? Like, we don't have to bulldoze the whole house, but it's also not a matter of just new windows and new furniture, right? Like, there's some pretty substantial problems here. I do agree with all of you who are saying that it's not necessarily bad for supports to be a bit detached from what's happening in the story. I did phrase it that way in the original video, and thinking about it, some of you are right, that it's not necessarily bad. It can be a positive to see characters interact about something that isn't just the current conflict at hand. I imagine if you had to write every line about that, it would get stale very quickly, especially if the main conflict is like Engages, where it's already not super interesting anyway. What I think we need is a healthy hybrid between both, let's call it on-topic and off-topic dialogue. And for that off-topic bit, yeah, sure, I guess a healthy portion of the support system as we have it can probably be used. But we do need way more on-topic dialogue with characters that are not relevant anymore. I think, again, Engage is a good example where a lot of the characters that join you are just retainers from other royals, and they don't really have their own agency in a conflict, so the supports end up feeling like almost alienating them further from the main cast, I feel like. I also think it's worth breaking up the rigidity of the support system and reducing the amount of conversations in a game. If you use Path of Radiance and SOV as a foundation, now that we've looked over all the games, we can see, okay, we should use Path of Radiance as a rough estimate of how many convos we want, as well as its base convos. And then we can take some other pages out of some other pages books, some other games books. Like Three Houses has that knack for having characters talk about current events if they're related. We can take Three Hopes' method of, not having every support level, having a support convo attached. Maybe some characters have an innate support bond, but they don't talk, or they don't talk as much, like in the early games. Actually, that sounds like too much work. Let's just get rid of all of it.